Welcome back, AP Psychers. In today's video, we are going to be talking about another of the psychological approaches or perspectives in psychology. We first started with cognitive psychology or cognition, which was the furthest color-coded column on the left. If you can think back to the color-coded columns in the back of the class. The second color-coded column in orange, though, was behavioral psychology or behaviorism. We'll run through sort of the exact same format of the previous video. Key topics that behavioral psychologists study, meaning if a behavioral psychologist showed up to a daycare, showed up to the mall, showed up anywhere to observe behavior, these are the topics that they would have interest in. The effects of rewards and punishment. One of the big behavioral psychologists was none other than B.F. Skinner, and prior to that, Edward Thorndike. Whether it was Thorndike or Skinner, their work together gives us the backdrop of what was called operant conditioning, a topic back from Unit 6. So I'm going to write here in parentheses, operant conditioning. A behavioral psychologist could show up to whether it's a gym, show up to the mall, or let's work with the daycare example, and observe children and observe how punishment and reward systems instituted by their peers or their teachers more specifically influence behavior. Why do students follow certain directions? Why do students repeat certain observable behaviors, like seeking out certain types of behaviors, seeking out certain types of toys, seeking out certain types of interactions? Maybe they've been rewarded in the past, or maybe they're avoiding certain behaviors because they've been punished in the past. So that's one topic that a behavioral psychologist would certainly study. Another would be the old classical conditioning flowchart. Are there any classically conditioned responses in the context of the gym, in the context of the mall, in the context of the classroom? Are, for example, animals going to respond to certain sounds? Are humans going to respond to certain sounds? We had plenty of examples of classical conditioning back in Unit 6. We had all of those flowcharts that we studied. Theoretically, a behavioral psychologist could seek out examples of classical conditioning. One other final thing that a behavioral psychologist would be looking for are examples of observational learning. Observational learning is often the easiest way of referring to the process of watching somebody during the process of modeling and then imitating that behavior. However, it's not inconceivable that you see synonyms like the word modeling or like social learning theory, or even something like vicarious learning to reference the process of observing another individual, observing whether or not they got rewarded or punished, and then choosing to either imitate that behavior or avoid using that behavior going forward. A behavioral psychologist might seek out examples of observational learning in the classroom, the gym, the daycare, etc. They might look for children, look for examples of children imitating the behavior of their peers, perhaps imitating their teacher, cutting something out, or coloring in the lines, etc. So those are all subjects that behavioral psychologists would seek to study. Names from Unit 6 that really stand out. We're going to start here with the operant conditioning ones. B.F. Skinner was the individual who conducted the Skinner box, or the operant chamber. We watched footage of a pigeon learning to peck at a disc or learning to turn around. Other iterations of the Skinner box involve mice learning to pull levers in order to be rewarded with food, the administration of food. He specifically was the individual who not only carried out the operant conditioning research, but then also identified all of those schedules of reinforcement, identifying that variable ratio was the most resistant to extinction. Other names associated with operant conditioning: Edward Thorndike. Thorndike's principle was a precursor to operant conditioning. Thorndike, although it was a simple concept, was dubbed responsible for coming up with Thorndike's principle, the basic idea that if a desirable outcome happens, you're more likely to repeat that behavior. It was that general principle that Skinner then expanded on in great depth. They are the individuals we associated with operant conditioning. For classical conditioning, we have our friend Ivan Pavlov with the Pavlov dog study. He was the individual that first discovered the classical conditioning concept accidentally. Our friend John Watson conducted the baby Albert study, who discovered that classical conditioning could in fact happen with humans in the baby Albert setup. There's a key psychologist, a little bit more peripheral though, John Garcia, who discovered that taste aversion specifically is one of the most easily classically conditioned behaviors, meaning you eat something that gets you sick, now you're very likely to avoid that food going forward because of the negative classically conditioned response that has occurred. And another key psychologist is our friend Albert Bandura. Bandura is the individual that conducted the Bobo doll study. Bandura is a key psychologist that we connect with observational learning. I know therapy has been removed for the 2020 AP exam, but I do like to point out a couple types of therapy techniques. There's actually quite a few. There's aversion therapy. If you were to associate alcohol with a drug that gets you sick, you're more than likely going to avoid drinking alcohol in the future. That's a really effective way to treat substance abuse disorder or alcohol use disorder. So that would be an example of a therapy technique that is predicated on this. Other examples of therapy techniques: exposure therapy, when you expose the patient to a stimuli that they fear. This is a really effective way of treating phobias. It's actually the #1 way of treating phobias. There's flooding, and then there's the way more popular systematic desensitization, which was that really methodical pyramid that we talked about, where you incrementally increase the exposure. We watched that video with the spider and the exposure to the tarantula. Those are really great examples of using classical conditioning to effectively treat disorders that are predicated on classical conditioning. The final one is the token economy. Now, if you reward a patient with a token, some type of desirable item, in the aftermath of carrying out a desirable target behavior, you're utilizing a therapy technique that's predicated on the work of Skinner and Thorndike that falls under the operant conditioning category. So although I know therapy has been removed from the AP exam, so I wouldn't necessarily memorize or try and really spend time studying any of this, if you understand how these work, they are in some capacities predicated on concepts that will in fact appear on the AP exam, or very well could. So in summary, if you see a question on the AP exam that asks, what might a behavioral psychologist focus on in this scenario, in this setting? While using the daycare example, they might look for examples where students respond to reward systems by carrying out behavior again and again, or avoid behavior because they've been punished in the past. That would be examples of operant conditioning from Skinner and Thorndike. They could look for examples of classical conditioning. Maybe a student got stung by a bee the last time they played at that toy chest, and now every time they see that toy chest, they feel anxious and avoid the toy chest. That would be an example of watching a behavior that's being affected by the classical conditioning flowchart. Pavlov and Watson are responsible for that. Maybe a student is choosing to avoid a certain food because it got them sick before. That would be an example of taste aversion, that negative, automatic, negative, classically conditioned response. That would be a Garcia, another byproduct of classical conditioning. Or maybe there's some observation going on in the daycare. That's clearly a byproduct of the research done by Albert Bandura.